time. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good, yes you do. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good.
Russell, this may only be week 2 in the series, but this is the third prophetic testimony to come from up here today about the power of faith in the face of fear. Because if you missed it, go back and watch it again as Pastor Amy preached prophetically about exactly that thing. And Russell and praise team, thank you so much for you and your gifts and your offerings, because that song right there was a similar kind of testimony as well. So thank you so much. I love being part of this team. I love y'all, and I love y'all. Now, we are talking today. I'm glad you clicked in today to hear an uplifting word, to re-energize yourself in the joy of the Spirit. Our topic for today, the fear of death. Okay. We'll come full circle on that, I promise. Now, Chapman University in California, which, by the way, is a disciples-affiliated institution, does an annual study ranking people's greatest fears. And for a long time, death floated between number 2 and number 5 on that list, always consistently ranked behind the number 1 fear, which was public speaking. That's right. People would rather die than stand up and speak in public. But I was surprised. I went back to the list in this past week, and apparently over the last couple of years, the numbers have shifted dramatically. Public speaking, at least for 2019, was down to number 54. Maybe people are getting prouder of what they have to say, perhaps. Death is down to number 44. Now, that was 2019. 2020, I don't know. That remains to be seen, right? Deshay and I talked about this last week, and we talked about maybe this was a function, at least in part, of the fact that a lot of young people just aren't afraid of death because it's not real for them. But still, I think it's important to pause and wonder at the fact that death ranked below things like losing my data, photos, or important documents in a disaster. You're not going to care about those documents if you're dead, all right? But anyway. All right, we've been talking about the book of Daniel, and last week we looked at chapters 1 and 2. This week we're going to look again at the fear of death and talk about chapters 3 through 6. Now first, let's back up a little bit, and I'd like to talk about biblical history for a couple of minutes here, because to the extent that the Bible, and I believe that it does, to the extent that the Bible holds together as a cohesive account of the grace of God at work in the world, it also tells the story of how the people of God have understood what it means to live, what it means to die. And my claim this morning is that throughout history, God has been growing us and God has been stretching us in that understanding. Now, just 2 weeks ago, we finished a series on resurrection, right? Which is so central to our understanding of faith and the movements of faith that it's hard to imagine things any other way. But guess what? The ancient Hebrew people didn't think about things that way. They didn't think about the cosmos, the reality of the universe, that way. They had no conception whatsoever of a human soul living beyond death. Psalm 146:4, when the breath of mortals departs, they return to the earth. On that very day, their plans perish. Maybe Job 14 says it most clearly. Mortals die and are laid low. Humans expire, and where are they? Mortals lie down and do not rise again. They will not awake or be roused out of their sleep. And it's not a punishment thing. in this model, mind you. It's just what happens to everybody within that ancient Hebrew perspective and worldview. Job 3:11 through 19 says that all the dead go down to Sheol, whether they are good or evil, rich or poor, slave or free. Everybody is existing there, a shade of their former selves, stone cold dead. Dead. Now, psychologists say that at the deepest level, that is what the fear of death is all about. We may fear the process of dying or the pain associated with dying, but when it comes to death itself, what we fear is annihilation, extinction. We are encoded with a deep desire to be, right? Shades of Hamlet. I'm reminded of the 2017 Pixar film Coco, right, which focuses on the afterlife. And what people fear in that film is not what comes after death, but what happens when you die, that final death of being forgotten to the world. Annihilation, extinction. And this is what ancient Hebrew people believed happened when you died, which is very different, of course, from what you see in the New Testament. So what happened? Well, it'd be too easy for us just to say, Jesus happened. And yes, that is true, and we'll talk about that, but it's too easy to attribute all of this shift to Jesus because new perspectives really began to emerge on this before the time of Jesus. And in fact, the book that was most pivotal in this shift was, guesses? Daniel. Yes. Yes. Thank you, brother of Daniel, Tim. Yes, anytime he says. The book of Daniel was hugely pivotal in this process of stretching. Okay, I told you we'd look briefly at chapters 3 through 6, and this section consists of 4 stories, 4 tales of events that took place during Daniel's time in Babylon. First, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. Sounds like a Harry Potter title. Chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar builds a giant idol out on the plains, and he commands that all his subjects will kneel and worship it. Word gets back to him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will not do so. They will not kneel before this giant idol and praise the idol. And so he brings them in, Nebuchadnezzar does, and says, you will either worship the statue that I've created, or I will throw you into a fiery furnace. And their response is awesome. This is chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Whew. All right, second story, chapter 4. Is about Nebuchadnezzar's second dream and a subsequent season of humiliation and then restoration for him. And the third story, chapter 5, is the story of the feast and the death of Belshazzar, the king and the son of Nebuchadnezzar, which, by the way, that story, go read these stories if you haven't. They're beautiful stories. And this story is the origin of the phrase, the writing on the wall, right? And in both of these stories, you see situations where Daniel is brought in to provide counsel to the king, and he refuses to sugarcoat that counsel, refuses to tell the king anything other than the truth, which is that he has been unfaithful to God. Even though he knows that in saying that to the king, that at a moment's notice, the king could lift his hand and remove Daniel's head. He speaks truth anyway. Fourth, the most famous story perhaps in the book of Daniel, chapter 6, the story of the lion's den. Daniel refuses to pray to King Darius. And Darius loves Daniel, and even though he hates doing it, Darius throws him into a den of lions in keeping with a legal decree that Darius had signed. But God shuts the lions' mouths, and the next morning Darius runs to the den and finds Daniel alive and well. Now, holding all of that, if their worldview were an ancient Hebrew worldview where death means annihilation, and if annihilation is one of our greatest fears, the fear that all people experience at the deepest level, why weren't Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shaking in their boots in all four of these situations? And maybe on some level they were. But I think the message is this, that there is a trust here that is greater than their fear. A trust that is greater than their fear. Is it a trust that God will not let them die? Maybe. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego acknowledge that they might die, and they say, regardless, still not going to worship your gods. The fear of death, friends, is a natural thing. But the call is to let our trust be greater than our fear. And I really think that's true on some level throughout the Old Testament. But now the people are being called to put their trust in this growing apocalyptic recognition. This recognition that God is doing something, that God is working toward something, that death will not have the final word. And we see this articulated powerfully in chapters 10 through 12 of Daniel. Daniel 10:14, Daniel has a vision of an angel who says to him, I have come to you to help you understand what is to happen to your people at the end of days. And this is the important line, for there is a further vision for these days. Daniel 11 prophesies that things will hit rock bottom and that it will be at precisely that moment that God will act to usher in a new kingdom. And Daniel 12 is one of the very first texts in the Old Testament that speaks specifically about resurrection, about the resurrection of the dead, which Daniel describes as happening at the end times. We'll talk more about those 3 chapters 2 weeks from now in week 5 or 7 or whatever that'll be by then. The point here, death is not the end. It's a new way of understanding the nature of things. And it was a few hundred years later that this perspective would be stretched again and find its fullest expression in the life and the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, friends, I have to tell you that I was stretched this week in this topic because in studying this, something shifted in me and I saw something anew, okay? For years, when I've been asked what the gospel is, I responded, Russell did a series on that question, right? What is the gospel? And asked us our perspectives on that. And I think what I said at that time was, the good news of Jesus Christ is that death doesn't have the final word. And that is so. But the author of Daniel was aware of that well before the time of Jesus. And now I think it's really more than that. It's more than that. The Christian perspective on death is not just that death isn't the end. The Christian perspective, the fullest Christian perspective on death, is that death is specifically a beginning. Put it another way, God uses death to create life. Maybe it's one of the greatest testaments to God's sovereignty, that God can do that God can use death to create life. We talked recently about Christian Piatt's beautiful observation that even if God doesn't create garbage, that God can make flowers grow in garbage. And as I really think about that, it's not just that God can grow flowers in spite of the garbage below them, It's that God can use decaying garbage to grow flowers, right? God uses death to create life. God uses the death of Jesus to show us the way to new life. God uses the act of baptism to bury us with Jesus and put to death our relentless commitment to pride, greed, and self-servitude. And God specifically uses our willingness to let things die, bad habits, destructive perspectives, sacred cows. God specifically uses our willingness to let those things die to open us to new possibility. Friends, this is exactly what is meant by the words of Matthew 16:25. And if you've looked at that text before and wondered what that was all about, go read it again in the context of what I just said. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Pastor Amy shared with me this week the words of Cynthia Borgo on the idea of dying before we die. It's a fascinating concept, and Cynthia said this: everything that's good, everything that's abiding, everything that's worthy, everything that's generative about a human being arises on the other side of our fear of death. The whole tradition we've had of dying before you die sounds like martyrdom from the outside, but what you really discover is it's the gateway to freedom. Love that. Jesus, within our own Christian path, not only tried to point toward what this new life is, but he also took us there. And he left us with the promise that he carries this, that he takes this on. Any one of us who summons the great courage within us to gird up our loins and die before we die are not left unaccompanied. It's on the other edge of that, the other edge of that willingness to die, that we are really set free to courage, to compassion, to generosity. These are alchemical products that grow on the other side of the human being not afraid to die. We can collectively draw upon those wonderful gifts, but it requires the personal willingness, as the old monks in the desert said, to sit in your cell and ponder the hour of your death until you've really worked through your system what this promise means. The promise of Romans 14:8. Whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. Whether we live or die, we belong to God. And with that, she says, having moved from something nice that you recite on Sundays to something that you know in the marrow of your bones, you walk into the planet as a vessel of love, and nothing can touch you. Maybe that's what Daniel and his companions were beginning to realize so long ago. Yes, the fear of death is a natural thing. We were built to want to be. But the great mystery is this, that if we will trust in God more powerfully than we fear, we will find the fullness. We will find that the fullness of being lies beyond the life that we know. I have done 65 funerals since I came here in 2014. 65. And every single one of those funerals, those times of being together with family, reflecting and looking forward, every one of those has brought me grief. And at the same time, every one of those has been a blessing for me. See, in Jesus Christ, we are made fully aware of the fact that God uses death to make life. That doesn't mean that we are cavalier about life. I'm not anxious to go sit in any fiery furnaces or lions' dens anytime soon, okay? But I do love to stand in silence in little Texas cemeteries, reading names on headstones and getting lost somewhere along that fuzzy divide between this life and the next. When I do this, I almost always find myself less afraid of death, more appreciative of life, and more aware that in the hands of God, it is all one.